grab a seat. Welcome, everyone. Beautiful day. I'm Pete Bellotti, in charge of the Hall of Fame, and we'd like to thank everyone for coming out on this beautiful day for our third Hall of Fame induction. And it's a real honor to see all of you here, and hope you guys have a great day and have fun. All right, and now here is the introduction of our ceremony, and thank you very much.
WCWP, where careers are born and memories are made. Today, we honor four of WCWP's very finest. Rita Sands, Ted David, Frank D'Elia, and Bill Epperhart. Welcome to the 2014 WCWP Hall of Fame. Now your host, WCWP alum, Jeff Kroll.
It's a nice shot. I was telling people I still have those headphones, so they're still in the basement. Good afternoon and welcome to this wonderful event. This is the third, as Jim just said on the recording there, the third WCWP Hall of Fame induction ceremony. I've been very happy to have been at the first two and am delighted to be your host here this afternoon. My respect for the four inductees is off the charts, and I had the wonderful good fortune of actually working with Frank and with Bill professionally once I finished my time here. Actually, some of it was during my time here at WCWP. And so that makes this a very special day for me. While I was introduced on there, just for those that don't know me, I was a student here in the early and mid-1970s and had the really good fortune to work with three of the four inductees. Rita is the only one I didn't get to work with, but always admired her as she went on to her fabulous career that we're going to hear more about this afternoon. I first want to acknowledge, he's sitting way in the back, Dan Cox, the Director of Broadcasting at WCWP, for his efforts in setting this up. And this is becoming a really special event each year. And you did briefly see Pete Bellotti, who was the coordinator of this event and helped arrange to have the voting and get everyone in, just voted in. And today is the big induction day. Pete immediately left. Pete said hi and ran. Oh, there he is. He's hiding out there. And our audio man, Zach, is currently on the staff at WCWP. Thank you, Zach. And just to let you know, once we're finished here today, Dan has invited everyone over to the station. You can come over to the station. If you haven't been over at WCWP recently, you should come over and see all the changes that have taken place. Even if you've been there, let's say, in the last several months, there are some new additions, some new twists and turns over there, so come on over and take a look. Dan is making this free this afternoon. It's free, right, Dan? The usual $49.95 being waived this afternoon. Free tour of WCWP as soon as we're done here today. So let's get the proceedings going. I want to introduce, there are two Hall of Fame members here today that were inducted both last year. One is the lovely and talented Bernie Bernard over here. And on this side of the room, the lovely and talented Bill Moser is over here. And I think I'm supposed to invite, Bill is supposed to join me up here first, as I understand the directions that we are under, this highly choreographed thing that we're doing here today. Now, are we supposed to move over here? And I'm supposed to bring the mic over? As you see, this was well rehearsed, folks, so I think we're supposed to. I believe so. We're going uptown, upstairs, on the podium.
You better have a NABED card with you to handle that microphone.
I used to. Hey, can you be a retired NABED person? All right.
What is your job, to sit there?
I think so, and I think you're supposed to sit here. And Mike, where do you want this bit of audio?
Put it on the ground.
Table over there?
Oh, yeah, on the table, fine.
Table would be good. By the way, it's Mike Chimeri, right over here, who has become our automatic recorder of events here at WCWP, taking pictures, and he'll be posting those pictures all over the place.
Actually, Michael is the station historian.
That's exactly the word I
That
was
too.
looking for. Right, the station historian.
Documented years of these events.
So, Bill, this is, you spent so many years with the station, and just anybody who is inducted into the hall ended up being a cohort of yours in one way or another, even going back to the original guys who you knew from the day. But this particular group are all four you're very close with through the years.
Very, very true, yeah.
Yes. And I think the first one we're going to start talking about, since we'll do ladies first, is Rita Sands.
Good.
And Rita is from the early and mid-1960s, and then went on to a fabulous news career, really at the top. And for a lady in those days, that was, I'm just going to move a little bit because I'm like turned away from you. Yeah. It was very unique. She, I guess the term these days is broke the glass ceiling. They talk about for women, and I guess did so really at WCWP first of all, and then went on to her career. What do you remember from her days at the station?
I didn't have a great deal of contact with Rita, but certainly subsequent to WCWP, she, I believe, was told if you wanted to get into this business, you had to get in as an engineer. And she went and got a first-class radio telephone license, and that was her entree to working at the ABC Radio Network, where she was able to basically have access to people that could assess her talents, and then from that point on, it launched a career on the air. So she was quite skilled, not only from an engineering standpoint, but also from being a network newscaster.
And one of my laments is that I only met her once. She came up to a homecoming event back in the 80s, and I don't remember what year it was, but there were so many people crowded around her that night that I never even got to say hello. But she was there that evening, and I know she was very special because so many people wanted to talk to her. Always admired her on the air, and it was always, even as a student, when we were told early on, Rita came through this place, and that was an inspiration that you could go on to really big things if you worked hard at WCWP. So that was all part of it. And that goes for all of the inductees here today. They all inspired us to go forward and do some great things in the industry.
Now, Bernie did an interview with Rita?
I believe. Is that where we're going next? We're going to Bernie Bernard. Had spent a wonderful afternoon during the week talking to Rita, and I believe we have that interview for you right now. So this is Bernie Bernard and Rita Sands.
I wanted to also congratulate the others who are sharing the honor: Ted David, Frank D'Elia, and of course Bill Epperhart. It's very nice to be part of that group. They all had great careers.
Yes, they did. And you had a particularly great career, too. We were listening to you, and I always remember Bill Moser saying, listen, that's Rita. Look what she's doing. Listen to what she's doing. You can do that, too. So thank you, especially for the women at WCWP for being one of the early inspirations for us.
Well, I've never quite heard that because I think I was one of the very first few women there, so kind of felt, didn't quite know what my place was, but enjoyed being there and really valued it. I also worked in the record library. I think I started in 1963 when the station was just actually getting its wiring together and was only heard in the dormitories. And then it got a little more power, and then we actually went to the exits toward Northern Boulevard, and then went a little further, and people in the area could hear. And now I understand it's got a great coverage area, which I think is really exciting.
And with the advent of the Internet, people all over the world can listen online. So it's a whole different thing. We have a worldwide audience now. So what was it like when you were a student here working at WCWP?
Well, I put myself through college, so I had lots of different jobs. And at the Brady Food Service, I worked in the bookstore to pay for my books. I was one of the people that worked in the dormitories and had a job in the at WCWP in the record library. And that's how that started. And I was one of the few women that started there. I may have been. And I remember a gentleman named Harry who was so smart, and he was putting wires together.
That would be Harry Lowenthal.
That's right. Yes. So there were only a few of us, and in the air until this is true. One day, everybody got sick in the cafeteria, and so it was my first opportunity to actually go on the air. And I had a small jazz show for the rest of the week, and really wrote out every single thing I said, including hello. I was excited, but I really wanted to do a good job and not disappoint anybody. So I knew where the records were, but then I went in there and had to kind of make it my own. And it was exciting. And even at that time, at the very beginning, somebody named Dan Ingram, you know who that is?
Oh, I sure do.
He used to drive by every day and listen to WCWP because he lived in Glen Cove. And when I was on the air, he stopped by and was staring through that big window in the lobby. And he went into where some of the engineers were, and they all stood up, and I thought, who in the world is that? He came in and introduced himself and said, I like the music you're playing, because he loved jazz. And he said, I like your voice, too. And he said, if you ever make it and ever get to New York, why don't you come by and say hello? And I said, well, I would. I said, who are you? He said, Dan Ingram. And, of course, I knew who he was. And, oh, my goodness, nearly passed out. And I was lucky enough to make it to New York. And then when I was at CBS, I walked across the street one day to ABC and found him and looked in the glass at him. And he remembered me. And I waved. And he laughed at such a talented, really wonderful, generous man. We became friends for life. And he had so much to offer me in terms of insight and encouragement. Of course, he was never what I would call a newsman, although I think he did a bit of everything. But he was quintessential radio, and in those years he was just perfection of the talk-up and the personality and the fearlessness, and such a beautiful voice. And he's still a friend. He lives in Florida and sometimes comes back to New York. And in those years, radio people were the really big ones. Were the stars. Were the private company we'd listen to at home and in our cars. They were such individuals and offered us so much encouragement if this was a field you were interested in, because you really had, like Gene Shepard, when I worked at a radio station at night, WNEW, I would drive home and listen to him and all of his stories about baseball. Do you remember that? Or
I was on NEW-FM in the 1980s.
Oh, how wonderful!
Right. So what era were you there?
Well, when I left WCWP, I was hired by WBAB over the summer, which is on Long Island, and then WGLI.
Rita, we are following each other. I have been following you because I worked at BAB from here and then went to NEW.
Well, look at that. Oh, I'd love to hear more about that. When I started, though, women weren't really welcome on the air, so I had to co-anchor with another WCWP alumni who is John Messerschmidt. Do you know that name?
Yes, I do.
And he had used for his air name Johnny Carl. He was so good, had a beautiful voice, and so he and I co-anchored at both those stations, BAB and GLI, and I was let go from both of those because they really weren't comfortable with women. And he was so good, he was a standalone. So then I heard there was an opening in a brand new format. This takes me to WNEW-FM. This was the first staff of all-women music DJs in
So
New York
you were
City.
with Allison Steele at that time?
Yes, I was, and I was like 20 years old, so I was 10 years younger than the youngest one. and they had me on from 10 at night to 1 in the morning, and that was our shift, and made some new history with that. It was very exciting, learned a great deal, then went on to ABC Radio Network as their first woman broadcast console engineer and tape editor. Do you remember we had a tape block, and you'd have to cut it on a diagonal and put it together with...
I do remember. Now we're all digital, but I was here in the days when we did that at WCWP and elsewhere.
Yeah, and the equivalent of Scotch tape to put it together, but that's when you could feel the sound as you tilt back and forth with both hands with huge discs, and then be able to make the correct edit. Loved that. Happened to be good at it and really liked it, but I was the first woman ever to do the console engineer work. Howard Cosell was there at the time, and I used to do his programs, and he didn't want me to, didn't trust a woman. One night I lost
He was
his
an old curmudgeon, though.
Well, even when he was young, he was an old curmudgeon, but got through it. Then on to WHN Radio as their first woman on-air reporter. Worked with Herb Oscar Anderson then. WCBS auditioned over there for All News, and I was their first woman anchor, which was so exciting. There for about 8 years. Then went over to CBS Radio Network, their national hourly news broadcasts on the overnight for 2 years, breaking me in that way. But it was great. And then hired away by Roone Arledge. You remember that name?
Sure do.
At ABC Network Television. I worked for World News Tonight and GMA and Nightline. I actually was one of the very first reporters on the scene of John Lennon's murder.
Wow. Back in 1980.
Yeah, and it was, I just come back from some other state working for World News Tonight, and then the staff of Nightline just sent a truck for me, and we drove over the grass of Central Park, went over to the Dakota Apartments, and started our live coverage for Nightline, and I guess it was a West Coast update at the time. My reports are on YouTube. They last forever. But you'll see that I don't start immediately, and that's because somebody gave me an earpiece with the audio of World War II in it. So I'm not sure why that happened, but it's a perpetual... There it is, especially on the sad anniversary of his murder. But that was an amazing event to be covering that early. We were one of the first reporters.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful stories. And I have to say thank you on behalf of all the women who have come through WCWP since. And I know you don't think of yourself this way, but you really did break the glass ceiling, pave the way for us, and thank you.
Well, I don't think of it that way. You're when you work so hard, it always feels solitary, doesn't it? And you try to do the best you can because there's no training as you go along, or at least there wasn't when I started. And you get very focused, and you just want to do the best you can. You can't imagine what the future will hold for those behind you. You don't want to. You want to make a road that's open with great promise, but really what's on your mind is surviving the day. So you don't think of it. I've certainly made mistakes, so also you don't really want to think of yourself as somebody who was somebody to follow or emulate. But in the totality of it, to know that this was a period where women had a very tough time, and I could tell you many stories that it was very painful and hurtful and even sad. It was difficult tonight.
We could probably share some stories about that.
Did you have a tough time?
I did. I was the first woman ever hired by the program director at WBAB, and I remember one of the guys saying to me, "You know, Bernard, what I like about you do your show like a man." I'm like, well, what the hell else am I going to do?
Oh. Well, did you think about who was coming after you, or were you just saying, I just have to do another day and the best job I can, and one will lead to the next? And
I think so.
The way you learn, right?
You do, and sometimes you have to steal the knowledge, I found, where you have to get somebody to show you how to do something. If nobody else would show you, you had to find one person and say, no, I really need to know how to do this. Will you show me how to do this the right way? So I call it stealing the knowledge. Sometime if people weren't volunteering it, well, you had to dig it out. You had to get it. You had to acquire it.
Observe, learn, and learn by mistakes. I I remember once I showed up at ABC, and I had bought a new little crisp blouse, and I had left the cardboard in the collar, and the cameraman said, "Why do you look so stiff today?" And just so many things I never thought about. I mean, today dressing up is a separate art form, but then that was one of the last things on my mind, and it was keeping up with all of the men around me and those that had serious doubts. I mean, when I worked at ABC Radio Network as a first console engineer, I had my life threatened. I had people stalking me.
Wow, I had no idea.
Oh, terrible notes left in my locker. It was a male locker room, and I had to go there and make sure there were no men in there when I put my books and my equipment in there. I had to join the union, NABIT, and the engineer, the director of engineers there, Harry Curtis, laughed his way through my interview and thought it would be humorous, and he said, "Go give it a try for as long as you can last." And he had absolutely no confidence that I would last. And I loved doing it, so I did okay, but I felt I was totally alone. And when years passed and I was back at ABC Television News, they said I had to go back to radio to file my reports. And I asked them, is it possible not to? Could I do something else? Because I was so uncomfortable there, the memories would come back. And they said, no, you have to. All the reporters have to do that. So I went back, and sure enough, I see immediately a lot of the same engineers who were there, and I felt, well, they're not going to like to have me back again. But that wasn't true. They sent an emissary out, and they said, Rita, it was a different time, and we want to say, would you accept our apology, and let's start over.
Wow,
and
that's
thought,
great.
How
Wonderful.
gracious. And it was a wonderful start again. It was important that I go back when initially I really felt maybe there was a way I didn't have to, but I'm glad I did, and we all learned through those days. It was it's a great career, a great learning experience, but through it all, I think what I felt most important was how we convey so much through voice alone, especially in radio, obviously, not the television. And that's why I returned to radio, because I love television, but it wasn't radio. Loved radio. And so when I was asked to return to WCBS for a drive time position, I left network television, which a lot of people wouldn't do, to go back to my first and longest love, which was radio, whether it's news or music or talk. But the connection that you have, that one-to-one, and the sense that it's like when people in college train to be athletes, or when they pick a hobby or pick a certain kind of line of training. It's how you define yourself and how you best find out who you are. And for me, a shy girl from Queens, New York, I grew up through my voice, and I learned to trust myself through my voice and what I could accomplish. And once I found that strength and that feedback, I knew that's where I belonged. And I think everybody should give WCWP a chance who goes to post, to go on and see, to introduce themselves to their own voice. Because people don't really know how it sounds until they go in, make a recording, spend some time, and figure out, gee, is this the person that I know? Am I projecting who I really am, who I really hope to be?
Well, thank you. I'd like to say congratulations again, being voted into the WCWP Hall of Fame, and we hope you come visit sometime if you're in this part of the country.
I look forward to it. It's one of the most beautiful places ever. Many good memories there, and many, of course, at WCWP. And to the people I share this award with, Ted, Frank, and, of course, Bill, this is something I'll never forget.
Well, that was really nice. That was Rita Sands, of course, and being interviewed by Bernie Bernard, who's right here. It's amazing. The two of you did have such similarities from your post days, the early parts of your careers.
Yeah, it was tough. As she mentioned, it was tough, but I have to say, thank you. While I was at WCWP, for people like Frank DeLeo, said, what are you doing? No, you do it this way. Bernie, what are you doing? And to Bill Moser, like, that edit really sucked. I know you can do better. Go back and do it. I know you can do it better than that. And to Bill Epperhart, who was wonderful. He mentored a lot of students there, and he was the one who would shake his head and go, Bernie, 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 what are you doing? No, do it this way. Don't do it that way. So, for all the people here, and for Dan, who's still doing that with the current students, especially the women at WCWP, everybody gets a fair shot. It's too bad Christina Kay is not here. She is the next generation, kind of passing the torch on to her. She is on the air at WAOK today. She was one of my former students. She's the program director at WCWP. She does voiceover work, so she's going to be helping the people following her at WCWP to learn what they can learn and launch their careers.
Well, obviously, Rita couldn't join us today, so Bernie will be accepting the plaque on Rita's behalf, and then, of course, we'll be forwarding it to her. This is the official WCWP Hall of Fame plaque that is being given to Rita Sands, class of 1966, being presented here in April of 2014. So let's give a hand, even though she's not here, to Rita Sands. I think you can put it down for the time.
Hey, Jeff,
Yeah.
a couple of thoughts. And listening to Rita, doesn't she sound great? Even to this day. She spoke about the record library and the stories that people can tell about things that went on in the record library. It was one of the few doors that could be closed. At some point, we needed professional record cabinetry in the record library. We had some steel shelves in there which were not quite suitable for LPs. So I had contracted with this company, Grenan Furniture, and they had built record cabinets for every radio station from here to California, beautiful crafted cabinets. And the guy came and measured and went away for about 2 months, came back with this carload of beautifully finished cabinetry in the back of his trailer. And he calls me aside and he said, I got to ask you a question. I said, yeah, what? He said, I've heard there are a lot of Jews on Long Island. And I'm going, what is this man talking about? He said, could you show me one? I could not believe that this guy, I guess he was from some way out in Ohio farmland, but he had never seen a person. I mean, I was speechless. I mean, to ask a question like that was in some respects so naive, but so obnoxious. But you know, in the rare occasion, I had nowhere to go with this. Unbelievable. The other thing that Rita pointed out was John Messerschmidt, who later became a project manager at NBC. He's no longer with us. I tried to track him, some of the history of what he did at NBC down, but it didn't go too far. And Dan Ingram, the reason that Dan Ingram was at WCWP is that one of his, I don't know, 10 or 15 wives was a student here. And he had a home in Oyster Bay Cove with a studio that he called the Marlboro Studio, because it was paid for by his voiceover work for Marlboro cigarettes. But Dan somehow got pulled into the station one day. I didn't have anything to do with this, because I had worked with him years later. And he recorded this promo, which ran just forever on WCWP in the days. And it went, hi, I'm Dan Ingram. Whenever I'm on the campus of C.W. Post College, I always listen to WCWP. And we ran that, not me, but I said, do you know what the man is saying? Whenever he's on the campus, he's never on the campus. Therefore, he never listens to WCWP. But it was the voice of Dan Ingram, and somehow that had that magic
Yes, that meant
Magic
something.
Sound, yeah.
Sure.
Whenever I'm on the campus, I always listen. Well, what do you hear, Dan?
Well, a lot of Post people ended up working with Dan along the way,
Did, yeah.
including Bill Epperhart and you, of course,
Yeah.
and Frank, who we're going to be talking about next. Is a guy named D'Elia here.
Mike Phillips.
And, Mike, also, that's right. So it's funny, Rita mentioned the ABC radio network, and I had the opportunity to work for Harry Curtis briefly also as a summer relief engineer. It was one of my first jobs while I was still in school. So Harry was...
I never worked for Harry. He was a terrorist, wasn't he? Didn't he ask
he was,
some really intimidating questions?
I think my favorite moment with Harry was they have fire drills in those buildings. That was at 1926 Broadway across from Lincoln Center. And every so often I had to run a fire drill. And if you know anything about the ABC radio network, it was 4 networks in one. And so there was constantly a newscast coming up somewhere around during the hour. There was top of the hour, 15, bottom of the hour, and then 55. And in between, there were things that were done, recorded, fed down the line, whatever they had to do. So if you wanted to schedule a true fire drill and really clean the place out, it had to be at a very precise time. Otherwise, you ran the risk of missing a network newscast, which wasn't really going to happen. So one afternoon, and I'm just, like I say, a summer relief engineer, so I don't really know what's going on. All of a sudden, the bells start ringing, and the guy says, "Oh, it's a fire drill. That's all right. Just follow everybody out." And so down we go, and there's Harry right by the elevator on the 6th floor there yelling, "This is a fire drill. We must use the steps, because if this were a true fire, the elevator would not work." So he made everybody run down 6 flights of steps onto Broadway, and it was the summer, like 95 degrees outside, brutally hot day. And eventually everybody gets outside, and then the murmuring starts. "Harry, we have a newscast in 7 minutes. Harry, we have a newscast in 6 minutes." And Harry's standing there, this is true, in a fire chief's hat. He had a fire chief's hat that he wore to run these things. And do you recall back in the 60s and 70s, the civil defense security bunkers that were built around town? Well, Harry had a CD, which is not the CD we know today, but civil defense. And he put on his civil defense armband and his fire chief's hat and escorted everybody down to Broadway, and they start yelling at him that now it's 5 minutes until the network news, Harry. And so finally they say, "Okay, all is clear." People are staring at us on the sidewalk, think we're all nuts, the entire staff of the ABC radio network. "All right, all is clear. I will just ask you to please allow those that have the next newscast to please take the first elevator up, and then the rest of you can follow." And we went back upstairs. That was the only fire drill I was ever involved in. I have never forgotten that, in the summer of 1974. So there we go. Let's move on.
No, we're not moving on. I got another story.
Sure, go ahead.
I never worked over at the 1926 because I worked 15 years at 1330. But when I got there, in a relatively short period of time, we had a gentleman by the name of Henry Plymack that was transferred down from TV. And the ABC building, every floor was eggshell white. And this was back in the early 70s. And Henry Plymack came in and said, no. Every fire extinguisher at 1330 had been painted white. And they put a sticker on it that said ABC. Well, for anyone who knows anything about fire, there's a class A, B, and C fire. And fire extinguishers cannot be painted anything other than red. Thousands of these things had to go out the door. I wish I had one. It would have been a collector's item.
Oh, the stories in these places, great stories in the industry behind the scenes that listeners didn't get to hear. We move on to our second inductee. Is a guy named D'Elia sitting over here that I think you know.
How do you spell that?
Frank, all I can say is one of the first people I met when I stepped into the station in 1971, and he had a way about him. He said to me, "What are you interested in?" I said, "News and sports. That's what I like." To this day, that's what I'm still a news junkie and a sports nut for those that know me. He says, "All right." And he ripped off a piece of wire copy from our teletype machine and said, "Read this." So I read it, and he says, "That's pretty good. Can you come back tonight and do a 1-minute newscast at whatever time?" That's how we were a little shorthanded in those days. The station had only been back on the air from a big shutdown, I guess, a few months, and it was actually good fortune for me because it opened the way. Anything I was interested in doing, there was a spot to do it. But Frank became he trained me very well and got me going in that place, and I owe him a lot for that. So Frank, and when's the first time you met Frank at the station?
Oh, about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
A turning point in the history of the station was when Steve Post was hired to replace our director of broadcasting. It was McConaughey, right? And Steve came from WBAI, and he had a very open-minded, let's say, ultra-liberal approach to programming. And there was a program that was produced on tape which featured a simulated female orgasm. No, this was, well, Steve Post was summarily fired, and I had been called by Dean Mates to come down and meet him in his Locust Valley home, and I was directed basically to shut that place down now.
You were the chief engineer
I was the
basically
chief
at the time,
engineer,
right?
yeah. So I came in, the old Collins transmitter, I took the final transmitting tube out and the crystal, and Steve Post was summarily dismissed. The radio station was then put into, well, it was occupied by dissidents, I guess you could call them in the day. There were hundreds of people that came to the defense of the people who worked there. I mean, we were a handful of people who worked there, but all of a sudden half the campus decided they had some affiliation with the radio station. And the station was occupied for 4 months by dissidents. And the university was somewhat fearful that if they closed the place down, that the building might incur some damage. So they allowed the occupancy of the building by the dissidents. And at 4 months later, President Peyton called me over and he said, "We got to do something to clear up this mess." He decided that, and the place was a pigsty. It was just a garbage pit of hippies hanging around and claiming that they had the right to say whatever they felt like on the air. President Peyton asked me to put the station back on the air, and I said, okay, but you know, I had to sort out issues. And it was with the help of Frank D'Elia that we were able to put the station back on the air with a handful of hand-picked responsible people like Frank and Ted. And in fact, Frank has some clippings, press clippings of Ted, I think, on the board. And there's a clipping, I don't know if we still have that, of you and Ted, I think, standing next to the transmitter. Oh, you did, yeah, okay. So Frank was very, very instrumental in getting WCWP back on the air some 4 months later, and has certainly been an inspiration to dozens and dozens of people from that point on.
Why don't you join us up here, Frank,
Yeah,
and
tell us.
instead of talking about you, talk with you. Frank D'Elia.
All right, thank you. Mr. Jeffrey?
I have one.
Oh, you have one, all right.
Fix your microphone, Bill.
See, obviously a kid did this because anybody our age, it's a big step, you know?
Hello. Tasting.
Well, you know, the reason I have a job at all is because one afternoon this man said to me, "You want to come to work with me today?" And we got into Volvo number 1, the black one, probably sometime in, I don't know, the late 1970 maybe, or even earlier. And we drove into work, and I spent 8 hours with him on the 8th floor of the ABC building, going back and forth between WABC and WPLJ. And I came out of there at midnight and thought, okay, now I know what I'm going to do, because I had no clue. I was one of those people, like many of us, who went to school in the late 60s. I started here in 1967. You knew if you didn't go to college, you were going to go into the Army, and there was this nasty little thing going on in Southeast Asia that most of us didn't want to do, so we did it. In the first year, I had 3 majors. I started as a drama major, became an English major, and I think finally became a music major. And that's how I wound up at the radio
But
station.
what drew you to come into the station in the first place? Because the radio station, those that know, we're right behind the Tillis Center over here, but none of this was here.
This was a
really
forest.
Right.
Yeah.
It was, the station itself was back in the woods in those days, and it was hard to find. You had to know it was there.
You did.
To get there.
I remember coming to an orientation at the radio station during freshman orientation in early fall of 1967. I was a commuter student, lived in Queens, and had been a bad boy the summer of '67 and wrecked the car that was supposed to be my transportation every day from Queens to Post. So I spent the better part of that year hitching rides with people I went to high school with that went here, somebody I'd meet in a class who lived someplace that I could take a Long Island Railroad train back to Queens. And then in the next year, when I was a sophomore, I had wheels now, so I was able to do stuff. As a music major, I had to take a distribution. They called that in those days. You had to take a distribution, some class above the 50 level, in a related part of the program. So it was an arts field. So you had theater arts, or you had art. And as a freshman, I took an art appreciation course, sitting in that huge hall in humanities building with about 350 other freshmen in the dark, watching slides for an entire semester. I know Christiana's World, I know Guernica, and there's a couple of other things, and that's what I got out of that, so I'm not doing that. So I signed up for this theater arts course called Stage Lighting. Went over to the little theater the first day of the class, and couldn't find the class, went to the secretary, and she said, "Oh, you're the one that signed up for it." I was the only one. So they canceled the class, so I went back to my advisor, and I signed up for Theater Arts 52, which was Introduction to Radio, taught by Mr. McConaughey at the radio station. So I had to find the radio station for class, and then he happened to drop that if you would like to get involved with the radio station, it might be good for some extra credit in the class, and that's how I did it. I started doing newscasts. Not quite as thrown in it as I did to you, but it was kind of that, and then that's how it started.
Well, I can compare it. I have a friend who went to Hofstra at about the same time, David Levy. You know Dave. And he used to be jealous of me because I was able to get right on by coming here. He went to Hofstra. It took him a year, literally, to say a word into a microphone. He had to work behind the scenes. They had so many people. They had to work behind the scenes and learn writing, which helped him because he became a fine newscaster and needed to write. But he didn't get on the air very quickly at all, and he was jealous of the fact that I literally got on the day I walked into the place, and by the next weekend, you had me doing news on football games, which was like 10, 15 minutes long. So, I mean, quickly you just... I always like to say Frank had the ability to throw you into the deep end of the pool, and you'd have to find your way out of the pool. So you learned quickly.
Hey, we needed people.
Yes, you
we
did.
didn't
You
have
did need
people, you know?
So let's go back now. So now you're working at the station.
Right.
But then Bill mentions that the station goes through this shutdown. So
Right.
you're working there at the time.
Yeah.
Now, knowing your dedication to the business, as I came to know through the years, and of course the Bill Epperharts and Ted, who have that professional
Right.
beacon in their heads about it. How did that strike you as all of this was going down, as the story that Bill just told about the shutdown?
it was very strange because that night that Bill had taken me to work was before this had happened. So I kind of had this path in my mind charted now, and then this happened. And I happened to be the news director at the station when it happened. And I remember it was like, what are we going to do? And the radio station was my home because as a commuter student, I didn't live here. I didn't have a bunch of buddies in the dorm and, the same kind of familiarity with the place that people who lived on campus did. Every night I had to get back in the car. We'd moved to Bayside then, so it wasn't as far away. And I could just get 88.1 on the radio in Bayside too, which was good. But the radio station was my home. Had an hour and a half between classes, you were at the radio station. There was a lot of nights you'd go home, have dinner, come back to the radio station and spend the night there until we turned the place off. So this was really traumatic. And I remember, these were my friends that were doing this, but Bill's right, people came out of the woodwork. It wasn't just about the 8 or 10 people that had worked there. Suddenly there were rallies. I remember there was a rally, and I don't remember where it was. We didn't have this place then, so I don't remember. Maybe it was in Humanities someplace in some big hall that they had William Kunstler speaking at. And it was like, we were children of the 60s. We didn't have Kent State to do, that kind of stuff that had happened a couple of years before. So it was that kind of a thing, and I just was kind of flabbergasted. And I guess I must have kept in touch with you during that time too. And we kind of were like, well, what are we going to do? What's going to happen? How are we going to do this? How are we going to get the radio station back? And it was important to us. It was our life, really. And to just go to class and be done with class and go home, there was a big empty part of us.
So then the opportunity came to put the place back on the air, and you depended on this core of a handful, as you stated.
Well, I was charged with this awesome responsibility at a very young age, and I wasn't more than what?
He was 12 at the time.
2 years
yeah, you were a couple of years older than us, that's all.
You guys, but...
and I think that's when you brought Bill in, too, didn't you?
That's correct, yeah, because we needed people who were focused on this.
Yeah. And you showed up at the right time, because there was probably, 6 of us running the place at that point. We had limited hours, right? It was 4 hours a day, I think, or something like that.
I think we started with 4 and we gradually expanded.
Yeah.
Now, William Kunstler filed lawsuit against the university, charging that the students' right to free speech had somehow been compromised, and of course that was summarily tossed out of court. But it was a major turning point in the history of WCWP. It was also outlined in a chapter in a book by Steve Post called Playing in the FM Band, which I think was an appropriate title. And there was a reference to me in there, not very
well, I can understand that.
Complimentary.
But he had like 3 months here, I think, didn't he? It didn't last long.
Steve Post is a brilliant broadcaster, but he was way out of his element when he came here.
Yeah, it just wasn't what he was looking to do.
Bernie is also part of that era, and she had a little trouble getting around, so if you guys don't mind, I'm just going to run down with this mic. We'll get a couple of her thoughts, because we've been talking about putting the place back on. Well, the fact that, you were also part of this, putting the place back on.
It was. I lasted, should get over here a little bit. I lasted about a week with all of the dissidents, and all these people showed up. They started trashing.
You were there beforehand also?
Yeah, they started trashing the station. I'm like, who the hell are all these people? And what are they doing to the place? This is our place. And again, I stayed for about a week. During this whole sit-in period, and it was kind of cool in the year of protest. It was, late 60s, 70 or
70s, I think, yeah.
70.
And all of a sudden, I got the feeling that, what are all these people doing to my station? They're trashing the place. Who are they anyway?
We didn't know. You'd come in and you didn't know a soul.
You didn't know who the heck they were, so I said, I'm getting out of here. I'm not going to be involved in this, because when the station comes back on, which I knew it would, I want to be there again. So I'm going to sit this out. And there was a dean who was here at the time, Beeman. His name was Dean Beeman. And I became a regular up in his office. When's the station coming back? I want to be part of it again. This is what I want to do in my life. I could transfer to Hofstra. He said, no, stay. It's okay. It'll come back on again soon, I promise you. And I said, I want to be able to go back there and be able to help put it back together again. And he said, just be patient, just be patient. And then I heard it came back on again, and came over and said, hey, I'm back. I want to help put this place back together again. That's pretty much what it was.
Now, Bernie, the station was clearly divided among a liberal and conservative faction, and that was not only politically, but it was also in terms of music
taste. Oh, sure, the top 40 and progressive people.
Yeah, progressive people on one side of the fence, and I again had to pull this diverse group of people together, and Mike Riccio was certainly quite instrumental in the putting the top 40 format back on the air. And who were some of the people on the freeform side? You were there, and Mark Indig, I think, or was he?
Trying to remember who. Now, Bobby, you graduated in '70. Mel Rosen was there.
Yeah.
Boy, I'm really...
Ken Franklin.
Ken Franklin. No, he was a little after
Later.
me. There was...
Later.
Kevin had left. Let's see, who else was there? Gary something. I can't remember his name.
Yeah. Chuck.
And then a guy by the name of Ed Mann, I believe, was there too. And I'm trying to remember the other folks who did the progressive stuff. Rick was more with the top 40 group, but the thing is, I think after the station was back, we appreciated each other. I don't think there was, we had differences in music, but I was happy to see these guys again. And the new people who came in too, like Bruce and Jeff, it was terrific. And you kind of put that aside because, hey, that's what they want to do. Maybe they're going to go into top 40 radio and they need to do what they do here, and I'm going to do something else, but I need to be here learning how to do this too. So I think we all got to be terrific friends. We used to kid each other about, the formats, but it was all in good fun. I think after the station came back on, there were some oppositions in musical styles, but I think we all really got along with each other. You agree?
I would definitely agree. There were classical shows too. I
Sure.
mean, we had Bruce Mahler.
That's
who,
right.
And who went on to a little bit of a career. I would
Bruce
say.
Mahler was an amazingly talented comic, and he appeared in, I think, at least 3 of the
Police Academy movies.
Yeah.
Bruce appeared on.
What was the show Fridays on ABC?
Friday,
He was one of the principal players on that, and
One of his acts was he was able to play classical piano in an iron lung backwards.
right,
Merv Griffin, yeah.
right. Merv Griffin took a liking to him. I know he did some stuff in Atlantic City for Merv, and he was also, if you're a Seinfeld fan, he was the rabbi on Seinfeld. There's only 3 episodes, but they get played so much, people think he's a regular on Seinfeld. And that goes back to his Friday days because those guys were all connected with that Fridays.
And Michael Richards was part of that, that troupe.
Yeah, and so he was at the station. He was doing classical stuff. Yes, we all learned to run the board.
Well, that's the thing that this one instituted, is we all got to do all kinds of jobs. And today, I have to look back, a lot of guys that, not so much now, but when we started, well, you started a long time before I did, but when I started, there were people that you worked with that had worked in some little station in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I always thought that my time at WCWP was like that. Because when I was working with a newsman and we were cutting news actualities in the days when you had to use a razor blade and a grease pencil, I knew what he was looking for because I knew from doing news at WCWP. When I was sitting working with a disc jockey, I knew what his side was like because Bill would have, whenever we did a music show, we'd work with somebody. We weren't doing combo. We were doing so that somebody else could get involved in the program and do the stuff. And Bernie's right. Sometimes it was somebody like Bernie, who we were doing. She might be doing a progressive show. And do you remember what we used to call the afternoon show, the Going Great show?
Oh yeah, Ronnie Haberman and Ted.
Yeah. And so that was, it was totally a different format, but you know what? If you could do that, you could do anything. That's I have to put that at Bill's feet because he was the one that, no little, and that's I think why we all got along too, because we all worked together because of that. Everybody did a little of everything.
Right, and I come in and I say to you, I want to do news and sports, fine, but you say, but you're still going to have to go down and get at least your 3rd-class license to get started.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to learn the board. And I'm looking, and those who know me know to this day I'm the least technical guy you will ever meet. But yet I became proficient enough that's the career I ended up with, was actually running a board, which is hard for me to still believe.
Tell me to believe that going down there to get your 3rd in that building was not one of the most
that was traumatic.
Memorable moments of
it
your
was very memorable.
college
I
career
had to
here.
pass. I had to pass because I wanted to keep working at the station. But yes, and that made us do a little bit of everything at the station, and
you got an
learn to get along.
appreciation for everybody's job. You
Yes,
knew
you did.
you might not, you might not be good enough to be sitting on the air in a New York radio station doing news or playing music, but you knew what the other guy was doing. You
Now,
could sit there and do
for
it.
those who think that we're taking an awful lot of time just as Frank is being inducted, and we are, but these stories actually go on. We're really inducting 3 people pretty much at the same time because Ted is involved in all of these situations too at that time. And of course, Bill was already mentioned by Bill, but and we'll hear more about him, but it's really all connected. So these stories kind of go on, and so they'd be a little shorter, I guess, too, because we're telling all the stories now.
Yeah, we'll find more, don't worry.
Oh, we'll find more.
What time do
Does
we
anyone
have
have
to get out of
anything
here
to
by?
say about Ted?
I mean, nice
But
things.
before we officially move on to Ted, let's officially induct Frank D'Elia into the WCWP Hall of Fame.
Do we have to move now? Or
No, you
Okay,
stay
good.
right there. And as was the case with Rita.
Should I stand up because I look like, like I'm...
All right, Bill, you should stand up for this too, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The official plaque reads, the WCWP Hall of Fame, Frank D'Elia III, from the class of 1971, and presented here in April of 2014. Frank D'Elia, newest member of the WCWP Hall of Fame. A little posing. There we go.
Okay.
The pictures. Congratulations, sir.
That means an awful lot. I have to say, I owe so much of my life to this place, to people like Bill, who aimed me in the right direction, and to just the stuff that we did here that gave me the tools I needed. I mentioned Kent State before. I remember when all that stuff exploded that spring, I was working in the news department at WCWP, and somebody handed me a cassette machine and said, go to Hofstra, they're having a demonstration there. And like you had your little press pass and you got into the basketball game, I went to Hofstra with this little WCWP press pass, had no idea where I was going, what to do, and whatever. Got this tape, it wasn't really great, but then came back and got thrown into the back studio and spent the next 7 hours editing tape. And that was the night I learned to edit tape. And it sucked in the beginning, but about the 6th hour, it was really getting better, and by the 9th hour, I could do it like nobody's business. And every time, I haven't touched a razor blade in a long time because we don't do that anymore, but every time I touched a razor blade and would do an edit, I would think back to that night where I learned how to do it.
We covered an awful lot of events. Bruce Leonard, who's here today, Bruce and I once got to meet Ted Kennedy. He was speaking over at Eisenhower Park, and we got to cover that one night. So WCWP opened some places for us to get into, another official thing that we did. So,
You
great
talked
stuff.
about the press card. I remember these little,
Yes, I still
Press
have one
card.
signed
Do
by
you?
you. Yes.
whoa. That brings up a point. Now, today everybody carries a digital camera or a digital phone around, but there's a lot of stuff that's out there. And Dan and I, over the course of the last couple of years, have had some conversations about an archive of all this stuff. I have, I think my wife has signed me up for that show, Hoarders, or whatever it is.
Okay, I can see that.
And
You never tried to leave the 8th floor at 1330 at 12:15 with Bill because he'd have to go collect his stuff. We would some nights be there for 20 minutes looking for his keys before we could leave.
that's very true. But one day there were 2 huge plastic garbage bags, barrels filled with Pam's jingles. Mm-hmm. They were headed for the garbage pail. Wrong. That would never get past me. But if you guys, and of course in today's world of digital, everybody's recording everything all the time, but if we can start to piece little parts of WCWP history together. And what I was saying about Dan is that we had a conversation a while back with the archives people over in the library, and they said they would be perfectly happy to preserve this stuff and make it accessible to anyone who wants to research the history. So I've got tons of stuff, and if you've got some things that you can digitize and you want to just say, let's share this with the rest of the group, funnel it into Dan and we'll take an inventory of
We
it.
can start with 3 rolls of
I got
3 reels of tape.
I understand
right-
you have
right
Dan's
there.
tape machine.
I do,
Frank brought
yeah.
them in today.
Because I don't have a tape machine at WABC anymore.
There they are.
Okay.
Sue is holding them up now.
I can digitize those. That's correct. Yeah.
Something to do with some shows and some interviews.
Yeah,
that,
a prison special we did
in 1970.
1970.
Wow. So it's well over 40 years ago. 40 years old.
I came across I guess it was a holiday card from Shirley Sandberg when we started doing community interview shows. Shirley from Roslyn, she was a just amazing woman out of the community that sat down and spoke with hundreds and hundreds of people. I looked her up the other day, and it appears that she's 93 years old. I was going to reach out to her and see if I can do a phoner. So if you got stuff that you're hoarding, and
those old cassettes,
Yeah.
anything, they can be heard.
I have
Even
the
Dan,
ability-
there's a cassette machine in the station. Is that still hooked up in the back? It could be hooked up again.
I have the ability to do reel-to-reel and cassette. So if you want to give it to Dan, and then Dan can pass it along to me, or he can mail it to me, or whatever, and we can probably have a YouTube channel or something set up for listening to this stuff.
All right, and I think now we will move on to our next inductee, Ted David, or as he's being named today, Ted David Gluckman. I'm reading the plaque upside down, and yes, it does. That's what he wanted on there. Yes. Your memories of Ted from those bygone days.
Anybody who knows Ted today knows him then. He hasn't changed, has he?
I have nightmares.
He's the same. Do you remember when we used to come back to the station after it turned off at night and he'd make funny phone calls too? There was I think it was it WHBI that used to sell time. Yeah. And there was a guy on, I think, Friday night who did the show, and we swore he did it from the kitchen of some restaurant someplace.
Yeah.
Because all you would hear would be glasses and silverware, and every once in a while somebody would drop a pile of dishes. And we would be sitting, I hate to say it, until 2 or 3 in the morning, sitting there with the station was off the air. Bill would go check, make sure the transmitter was dead, and Ted would sit in the control room and make crank phone calls. And Bill and I would sit in the studio and laugh our ass off. And he would call. What was his famous one? Do you remember his famous one?
Well,
can we say that one?
The guy that was doing that show on WHBI was Happy Holiday.
That's right.
And Happy Holiday had a jingle, which was Happy Holiday.
It was the song. He just cut it out of the.
It was just so bad, and you could hear a phone ring. He was taking phone calls on the air, so there must have been a phone right there next to the microphone. And we figured out that basically, if we called, we could hear ourselves ring on the air, and we realized there was no delay.
No delay.
So Ted, who is just brilliant when it comes to being spontaneous, he gets Happy Holiday on the phone. He says, I want to dedicate a song to all the Schwarzes in Brooklyn. Okay? So Happy Holiday goes on the air. He says, yeah, this is going out to all the Schwarzes in Brooklyn. We couldn't believe that this guy was that dumb.
Ted got off the phone, came into the studio. We all sat there for, I guess, like 20 seconds, and then he did it. And I don't think we could do anything else the rest of the night. We just laughed. Ted was always the one to talk you into anywhere. You know, if you wanted to go anywhere, oh yeah, we're going. Come on, we'll go. And he'd go. I think Ted worked. He must have worked at PIX then.
Yeah.
And he would just go in and say, oh, blah, 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 blah. And these people would have this look on their face, like, you know, and he'd have like 4 or 5 of us in tow, and in we'd go to someplace. And it was like, how did you do that? It's the old thing, just act like you belong, and nobody has the nerve to question you.
I guess we were the original jerky boys, though, with those crank phone calls.
Well, the jerky part, at least, yes. Well, I remember Ted telling me years later that he was telling his kids, oh, you know, we used to do this back in the early 70s. This is nothing new, you know.
Well, Frank and I, when we were at WABC, the old button sets, I think they had a dial in those days.
Yes.
There was a technique of taking the phone apart and pulling out one of the springs, which when you pressed a button down, another button came up. And by taking the spring out, you could push 2 buttons down simultaneously. So we were calling the pizza places.
Right. Or two Chinese restaurants, Shinlan East and Shinli West. We never worked for a living. I mean, that's what I discovered going to work with him that night. You know, I don't know, was it your line when people would say to you something about radio and you'd say it's better than working for a living? I've been saying that for 40-something years now.
Not mine.
Well, it's true. I mean, you know, we would do this stuff. We would sit in the shop, and the phone in the shop was permanently like that. If you wanted to make a phone call, a regular phone call, you had to put two fingers so that you only got one button down.
Ray's.
And
Hello, Ray's
yeah,
Pizza.
Right. Ray's, right.
Ray's, what do you want? This is Ray's. There are 10 Ray's pizzas in the phone book.
And then they'd start fighting with each other. We called two Greek delis one time, and they started yelling at each other. We got Bessie, the cleaning lady, in, and said to Bessie, "What are they saying?" She was Greek, and she says, "Oh my God, I can't say those words," and she ran out with her hands over her ears.
Well, back to Ted.
Ted, yes. He started this. He was the one.
He did. He usually does.
The great thing about Ted is he can do it with such a straight face. What an amazing prankster, though. Some of the stuff that he
came up to visit me at ABC one day. One of his sons wanted to meet Bob Grant. So he was at CNBC at the time. So I went into John Minnelli, who was the program director, and I said, "Look, I went to college with Ted David from CNBC." He said, "Oh yeah, I know who he is." I said, "He called me the other day. His son and he are big Bob Grant fans. Do you think it would be all right if he came up and spent a half hour, 45 minutes in the control room and just watched? They'd like to watch Bob do a show." "Oh yeah, I don't think there's any problem." So he comes up, and I have him in the control room introduce him to the engineer on doing the show and the producer, and everything's good. And I had to go do something, and I come back, and Ted's not there. And I had no idea where he was. And I found him in Rush Limbaugh's studio talking to Rush Limbaugh, and it's like, all right, where did he will go anywhere, he will do anything. Don't put any kind of a challenge in front of him. He will accept it and make you sorry you put the challenge down.
That is true. I just a few months ago, he invited me over to News 12 one evening, so I went over there and I'm watching the newscast, and that particular evening he was working with Lee Tyrell, who's been there for forever, I think, since they built the place. And during one of the breaks, she calls me over like this. She says, did you really say you know Ted for over 40 years? I said, yes. Tell me, what was he like 40 years ago? I said, That's him. Impossible. I said, no, that's exactly the same guy that I met 40 years ago. And for the rest of the night, she kept, during break, she would just look over at me and just shake her head. So he...
and if anyone who's a Facebook friends of his knows he's also the king of selfies.
Yeah.
He has gotten it to the point that you don't even know they're selfies anymore. He does it so well.
What a perfect lead-in, because we're going to hear from the man himself. Ted can't be here today, but has sent along this message to all of us from his home down in the Sunshine State of Florida. Are we ready to roll, or am I in the old days stretching? What are we doing? We're ready to roll? All right, this is Ted David.
Good afternoon. And happy Saturday, and a happy Hall of Fame, WCWP Hall of Fame Induction Day. I had hoped to be in New York, but for reasons that were unforeseen at the time, unfortunately I am still here in Florida. With that said, first let me say thank you very much for this honor. Clearly there is a lot to be said for being named to the Hall of Fame of WCWP. Of all the radio stations, and there's Hofstra, and there's Delphi, and WFUV, and so on, I suspect our station has turned out more people who worked in the industry successfully, be it radio, TV, on the air, or off the air, than any other station. And I don't think we're always necessarily recognized for that. In any event, congratulations to my fellow inductees, Bill Epperhart posthumously. And Bill, we do miss you. And of course, Rita Sands, with whom I am in touch regularly, and Frank D'Elia, who continues to work actively in the business at WABC. Well, that's a great crowd of people to be included in with, along with the previous inductees. And I just want to say thank you very much for thinking of me and including me here. Of course, I got my start at WCWP back in 1968. It was Bill Moser who I first met with my father when we came into the station, and it was Bill's maturity, Bill's vision, and Bill's knowledge, even back then, that led us to decide this was the place for me. And of course, thereafter, it became clear that WCWP was the best operated, best managed radio station on a college level. When Bill developed his contacts with ABC, we ended up with all kinds of equipment that was handed off. And so we ended up with a very professional station and a place that allowed many of us to learn how to do our trade, practice our craft, if you will, in such a way that we were easily able to get commercial jobs. Certainly, thanks to Dan Cox for his continued administration of the radio station. Thanks to Pete Bellotti for keeping us all together. Thanks to Pat and Jeff Kroll for their new role in the Alumni Association. And thanks to all of you for being so kind and generous with this award and recognizing me as a WCWP member of the Hall of Fame. Have a wonderful celebration, and congratulations to all.
There you go, Ted David. Now, Ted did, just like everyone else, Ted did a little bit of everything at the station through the years. I mean, the joking part aside, I mean, he did a lot for the place while he was there, and then long after, he gave his voices, I don't know how many times over. He was on every jingle we had there for years.
And Ted was one of those that started to work professionally very early on. He, some of us waited till the end. He did not. I think he was hardly in the door, and he was working, and then he'd come back with these great stories of being at HLI or one of the other many places he worked at.
Even filling in at ABC during a strike when he was very young.
Yes, we've heard that story a lot.
Yes.
When he made the leap to television in the early days of CNBC, I think he was one of the first at CNBC. Yeah. There was another guy there from WCWP by the name of Mark Haynes. Now, Mark is no longer with us. Mark Haynes. Mark came from WCWP. Now, Ted and Mark were here at two different times, so they didn't know each other. But when Mark landed at CNBC, I said to Ted, he's one of us. And they co-anchored morning show for many, many years. It was kind of interesting. It was the odd couple because Mark was just crumbs all over the anchor desk and Ted was so meticulous. They shared the same dressing room and they were at each other's throat constantly until they realized that they both had the similar sense of humor and a sense of timing. Ted's sense of timing is absolutely astonishing. He can talk up records. He can sense the pace of a TD on the switcher and pull crap just before they call the camera shot. And some of the antics that, when I was down in Charlotte with Ted a few years ago, we visited the NBC hub down there, and this engineer comes out and he says, "You're Ted David?" "Yeah." And he said, "I got to show you something." He had collected all of these crazy outtakes from the Ted when he was prepping to do a feed. And this was just a marvelous collection of the essence of Ted David off the air. But Ted and Mark finally realized that they were quite a tag team in the morning.
Well, I think I think the three of us are going to have to stand up so that we get the official picture with the plaque.
Is he watching us? Do we have Skype on?
He probably is, knowing him.
If there's a way, he has it. But this will be presented, as the others were, WCWP Hall of Fame to Ted David Gluckman, class of both 72 and 74 when he did graduate work, and presented here in April of 2014 for Ted.
All right. Don't send it to him. Don't have it. Just tell him Moser's got it.
And just before we move on to our last inductee here today, a few words from the aforementioned Dan Cox.
Thank you. Now you don't have to clap. I have a couple of announcements to make, and I'm sorry I'm extending this even longer than it is because I really want to get to the last inductee. Just a little update on the radio station. We're on 24 hours a day now, guys, not just 4 hours a day. We run programming for the local community in much in the way Bill Moser did when I was a student 30 years ago. We run music programming just like Bernie did back in the early 70s, and we run other formats that match the 53 or some odd years now of the history of WCWP. One of the big differences today than when Bill was my mentor and director of broadcasting is financial. And I hate that whole part of this business, to be honest with you. Public radio is in trouble. Public television is in trouble. The money's just not there. The economy over the last 4 or 5 years has been terrible for all of us, for many of us, I should say, not all of us. We're very fortunate, though, that I've kept alive a tradition that Bill always had, that we never beg for money on the air. It's always been my belief that that takes up very important content time on the air, and it usually annoys me when they go to those begathons on radio, on public radio and public television. So we do things behind the scenes. We run programs for the public. Recently, last fall, we ran a concert with Art Garfunkel, which was very successful, and we've run programs since then for radio plays and concerts here at the university. And some of them have been lucrative, some of them have just barely broken even, but they all add to the coffers of WCWP. And I want to thank many of you here today, I can't do it individually, who also donated when you registered to come here today. We truly appreciate the donations that you give to us. But I have some really wonderful news today. And I'd like Zach Parker to step out. Where's Zach? This is Zach Parker. Zach is a student here at WCWP, and he is responsible for the audio and the video and all the electronic equipment here today. He's our engineer. Zach has had an interesting history. I'm not going to go into it. No, I'm not going to go into it. He was here 2 years ago, and he had to leave for a year, but now he's back. And with him comes a really wonderful family, the Parker family, which includes his father, Gary, who Zach brings me this morning news from his father that he has secured $7,500 in donations. And I want to thank the Parker family and Zach publicly. The money comes from the Parker family and from another family whose name I wrote down, the Liss family, Harry and Melissa Liss. It's an incredible donation. It's the largest sum we've had at one time in a very, very long time. But I'm really proud, and I'm very thankful for your family to be part of WCWP. And he'll be standing here probably, hopefully 30 years from now, getting his own plaque, all right? So thank you, Zach. Oh, wow. You keep it coming, buddy. Keep it coming.
Very nice. Very nice.
Very exciting news he gave me this morning. It really kind of brightened my day. And again, thanks to everyone in the room here who also donated this year. Last thing I want to say is just on a personal note is that I really love this event. I really do, because I'm a history buff. Bill knows that. Bill and I talk often about how the history of WCWP has been spread so far and wide, and we need to collect it and get it in a space where everyone can enjoy it. I love meeting all the people I didn't know who ran the place well before I did, before I came as a student. But the four this year, that's 6 degrees of separation. We're all connected in some way. To Rita, as an instructor here, she's an example I use often with the young ladies in my classes, that this is a woman who went through incredible pain to break a lot of barriers for women. And Bernie talks about her often too in her classes. Frank D'Elia has allowed me to reconnect a very important connection which was missing for the years between the time that Bill Moser was director and I came in the early part of the century here. We could say that now, the early part of the century. Wow, they're going to talk to me that way, huh? But Frank did me a favor, and he called me and he said, we need some people up here at WABC. It's something Bill used to do, and we reconnected, and he's hired a few of my guys even before they've graduated, and that connection is reestablished, and that is a true thank you, Frank, for that. And that's one of those things that WCWP does so well. Ted is Ted. And you guys were very kind to Ted today, and he's a very good man. He's a very talented individual. And while you didn't say it, Bill, he was a CNBC founder, but I cut his demo tape to get that job. So Ted and I are connected in that way. And last but not least, certainly not least, I look at his picture every day when I come into the lobby of WCWP because it hangs there on a plaque. I sat in his class when I was a student here and was enamored by the brilliance of this man that you're about to induct. Kindest human being, always told you, you know, you got that wrong there. You know, I used to love when he said that. Whenever he let off a sentence with you know, you knew he was about to tell you did something wrong, but he was always going to say it in the nicest way on how to get it right. A man I truly did admire, and to a certain extent, as one can as a student to a professor, love very much. And I'm looking forward to the induction of Bill Epperhart. You all have a great day, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will get to Bill in just 1 second. As an MC, I failed because when we were talking about Frank, I should have started, before we even got to the radio stuff, that Sue and Frank are new grandparents just this week, and that's the biggest news. That's better than even the Hall of Fame. So congratulations to the D'Elia family. And then to follow up on what Dan said, as we move on to Bill Epperhart, I would just like to say that as far as I'm concerned, you could make the case that Bill Epperhart is already in the WCWP Hall of Fame, because about a year after he passed away, in the spring of 2001, we had the plaque dedication ceremony that Dan just referred to, and that plaque is hanging right in the lobby of WCWP. And we just didn't have a Hall of Fame to call it the Hall of Fame, but if you think about it, that day we put Bill into the WCWP Hall of Fame. The ceremony was a lot like today, a lot of stories and stuff, but it was a little cramped because we were right there in the hallway of the station. But you could make the case that today we're simply following up on what we started 13 years ago, just about this time. It was in the spring. And that is just to make official what I think we really did that day, which was to put Bill Epperhart in the WCWP Hall of Fame. In effect, I guess the first member of such.
Sure.
So with that as the backdrop, we begin to talk about our dear friend Bill. And who better to do that than Bill? Where do you start?
Yeah, where do I start? I met Bill in high school. Now, I grew up in Seacliff, and Bill grew up in a house that's a block away from where I live now. My grandfather built that house, and he was up on Orchard. We came together in high school. I went to parochial school in Seacliff, and he went through the public school system. And somewhere along the line, guys like us, we just find each other.
You went in the technicians club in high school or something like that? That's what everybody was, I'm sure.
Yeah, the AV squad.
Exactly. We all did that.
Yeah.
You could get the film strips working, you know.
I guess it was in the freshman year that we were working on theater productions together. Bill's mother was a New York City school teacher, and Bill's father was an extraordinary musician and taught organ and guitar, I think, and what else, Dan? What?
Voice.
A voice out of a studio that they had in their home. And Bill and I would just spend countless hours after school. Bill was an avid ham radio operator, and so two geek high school kids are hanging out. The Epperhart family was just an amazing collection of talent and hospitality, and his mother was always making us something to eat lunch, and his father was just an amazing storyteller. And Bill was an amalgam of his mother's just wonderful sensitivity and appreciation for life, and Bill's father was kind of a curmudgeon in some respects. He had kind of a skewed, probably a more practical view of life than Bill's mother. But what a wonderful experience growing up in the Epperhart household. And we had just endless, wonderful experiences in high school working together. And when I jumped over here to the radio station, it was just natural that Bill spent time up here. And eventually he became an instructor here. And Bill's, I think, had this amazing drive to want to share his knowledge with the world. And one of the great lines that just echoes in my head is what you can do with a database. He would just grab you and just drill you with what you can do with a database.
He was the first one I knew that had a computer.
Yeah. He tells a story of being in Radio Shack, and a salesman was a little frustrated with a customer, and the customer was yanking the salesman's chain about, well, what can I do with a computer? Why do I need a computer? And Bill said, well, if you have to ask what you need a computer for, you don't need a computer. Bill had a wry sense of humor. He was a musician also in his own right. And when we worked together at the radio station, again, he was instrumental in putting the station back on the air in 1970, and eventually he worked at Channel 7 at one point in his career, and I watched WABC, and then our careers came back. He came to WABC, I think, in a layoff or something at ABC TV, and then he spent many years working with the same wonderful people like I did, Ingram and Brucey, and he was really bonded with Ron Lundy. It was a very close relationship there. Pick it up from here.
I first met Bill when he came up to the radio station. Bill was one of the people that this Bill brought in those days when we came back, and I think he'd been laid off from television then, so he had some spare time, and Bill said to him, I'm doing this, I really could use your help, and he came up, and we became fast friends. I owe my life today to WCWP and two Bills. This one, who took me to work that day, and Bill Epperhart, who's the reason I'm married to that lady for the last 35 years and have 3 great kids and now a granddaughter, because the Epperharts had a party on July 3rd, 1977. We were on strike.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that, Mike? You and I were VRs. Mike and I were VRs at that time at WABC. I had come back April 17th, and we went on strike May 17th. And we were on strike until the following October. It was a lot of fun. We had a good time picketing in front of 1330 that summer. But they invited a lot of us to this party. And that's where I met this lady. And we found out subsequent that that was kind of the plot. It was a little matchmaking going on in the Epperhart household. So those are the two people that I owe my life to. And Bill and I became fast friends. We went on vacation a couple of times together. We were at each other's house all the time. I, too, shared in, as Bill said before, his father, Mr. Epperhart's stories. And they were great stories, and he was a great storyteller. Bill and I would wind up going to dinner all the time. Neither of us we were at a certain point in our lives where neither of us had a relationship going. So we would go to the radio station. One of us would look at the other one and say, you want to go to dinner? And we'd go to dinner, and then we'd go to the movies or do stuff like that. We had a great time. I remember Bill, in the beginning, I think, was driving a hand-me-down Dodge Compact probably from the Epperhart family. And at some point, probably in the early 70s, I think he'd started to work at WABC at that point, and he went out and bought a new Dodge Charger, and it was green. And I remember he was enamored of this car because he had this old family hand-me-down, and one of Bill's favorite expressions, we'd go out to places, we'd go to the movies, and there'd be all these people buying popcorn and all these people. We'd stand back and he'd go, oh, look at the rubes there. He loved watching people, and he loved watching people doing stupid things, because if you stand and look at enough people in a group, you will see most of them are doing dumb things. And Bill loved to look at that one over there. We'd have a great time doing that. And then I remember I was working at WHN at 400 Park Avenue, which is on the Park Avenue side of 54th Street. And Bill were working at WABC on the 6th Avenue side, and we would we'd come to work together, we'd go home together. There'd be a lot of times where I would drive out to his post, and the three of us would go together into work, and then we'd come home. And again, those were nights where we all got off at like 12:15. We'd get back out here at 1 o'clock. We would sometimes leave when the sun was coming up in the morning. We were just radio friends. We were just real. You know, it was like you could say anything, you could ask anything, you could tell anything. Subsequently, a little bit later, Bill worked at WHN when I worked there. He wasn't really happy with it because it was kind of it was a great place for me to start, but it was kind of a second-tier radio station at that point. And after he'd worked at WABC, it really didn't work well for him. So he stayed there a little bit of time, and then he moved on. But, I would run...
The reason he moved on was that there was so much time that you could work
right.
at
Yes.
a place, and contractually, they either had to hire you permanently. So,
Right.
and I think it was a real heartbreak for Bill, because it separated him from people he really loved, and they loved him, like Ingram and Ron Lundy.
And Bruce. He
Bruce,
had a great
yeah.
relationship with Brucey, too.
Yeah.
It was a hard time for us. I guess it was the height of the EEOC period of where the FCC really was on the station licenses to hire minorities and to hire all different kinds of people. You know, Rita talked about before about when she went to the ABC radio network that it was a male-only club, and I think that the FCC had really been pushing on the station licensees to change that. And it was really hard if you were a white male in that early part of the 70s to get a job. So that lots of great people came through as VRs. Mike, same thing happened to Mike Phillips. You came through, everybody loved you, you were a great time, and you had a certain amount of time. There was 17 or 19 months you could do total, and the companies weren't hiring them. They were hiring, you weren't what they were looking for as good as you were. So Bill was very upset with that. I know that really bothered him because I think he had really found his place there at WABC. And that's the kind of great knowledge that he brought to this place when he built that back studio with that old board. He took a board. How old was that board at that point? Maybe
Came out of FM2, I think.
Yeah, but that was 15 years old at that point.
Yeah.
So far away from state of the art. Bill painstakingly took that apart, and he really based that studio on Studio 8A at WABC, which was our main air studio, to the overbridge, to the clocks, to everything, to the remote starts. When he was finished with that studio, that was as good a studio as any radio station in America had. And the students here got an opportunity to not only experience that, but to have the gentleman who built it show them how to work it. And you know what? It was a thrill to watch Bill work aboard because it was intuitive, and I think it was probably the musical background.
Yeah.
I mean, I found that was something with me too. I did finally graduate from this place with a music degree, mainly because I told a theory teacher when we had the practical, I think it was in my senior year, don't worry, I'm never going to use this stuff, I'm going to be a radio engineer. And she gave me a C-, and that's how I graduated. But Bill editing. Bill was the best editor. I remember we would hear songs, and he'd say, "Ooh, that would make a good bed. I can make a jingle out of that one," And he'd hear something in the track that was just he could take the beginning and the end and put it together. And these were the days when editing was an art. Today, give me Adobe Audition and anybody can edit anything practically. But in those days, with a grease pencil and a razor blade, you had to be good and you had to hear it up here because it wasn't like today. That doesn't work. Undo. You couldn't do that. Well, if you did, you had to pick it up off the floor again. And after you had it backwards, you had to try to put it back together again.
Take the pieces out and make your mark on it.
Yeah, but when you take a long piece off and you roll the chair over it, it gets a little bit touchy at that point, But Bill had great ability to do that. He had a feel for it. He had a sense of it, and he could hear things, and then he could make them happen. Which it was just a wonderful talent he had.
Bill was a Renaissance man. He was an artist and a technician, and it just came together in this beautiful ball of wax.
Yeah.
His documentation was so meticulous but his appreciation for using the technology to enhance somebody's life with whatever art was on the other side of the microphone, or whether it was a voice talent or music or whatever. We had, I think we had an amazing relationship, and there were so many things that went on between us that was unspoken. He would know what I'm thinking, and I would know what he was thinking. And WABC in those days, we didn't have a plant intercom system. We had to dial up the other studio. We didn't have to do that because he was frequently in one end of the building, I was in another end of the building, and we knew exactly to the fraction of a second what each of us, had to do. I'm on Old Country Road from time to time when I pass Holyrood Cemetery. I just give a little wave.
I used to love, every once in a while I'd run into him on a Long Island Railroad train. We'd both be coming home from work. And it was 35 minutes of non-stop talk, because we just had, how about this, did you see that? Oh, this, that, bum, bum. Something from our past, something from our future. And I remember saying when he died, you don't know when that's going to end. You don't appreciate what you've got sometimes till it's gone. And just those happenstances, those meetings that you had, and it could be a year since we'd seen each other, and it was like it was the night before. It was just very comfortable. We all fell back right into that rhythm. And it was just, it was just one of the wonderful things that came from WCWP. Why it's our home. We just were able to do those kind of things and meet such great people, and Bill's right up there on the top of the list.
Well, he certainly taught me everything I knew about tape editing, and enough so that those of us ended up working with him at NBC. Just from learning what I did here, within a few months of being in there, all of a sudden I was in charge of production at WNBC Radio. It's a 50,000-watt radio station. How in the world are they trusting this to a kid? But I was trained out here, and Bill's the one that helped me learn how to edit, and so we did. And I always said that what I learned in this station, I was never challenged professionally more than what we challenged ourselves to do here. Everything came easy wherever I was because we made it hard on ourselves here. We timed out newscasts to the hour. We didn't have to. We weren't meeting a network or anything, but we did it, and we did it every day, and we kicked ourselves if the news went on 10 seconds late, which is ridiculous here for a 100-watt radio station, but we were determined to get it right. And so then when you did go to work for a station in which you did have to hit the network, it was easy. I was doing it every day. And Bill is definitely one of the guys who taught me day after day sitting there and just editing and editing. It was a joy. It's everything that it did. And he just happened to always be in the right spot with me at the right time. Ended up at WHN, you mentioned it a few times, I ended up in the news assistant's job there on weekends, and you guys would be there. It was pretty good to be a kid from Post, and two Post guys are actually the engineers there on Sunday. That's not really working, like you said. That's just fun. And then NBC, I get hired by NBC, he ends up at NBC, and we're working together there. And there was a night, it was the second great New York blackout in 1977. It was very fortunate that he was there working at NBC. He was running the FM side, and I happened to be on the AM side when everything went out, because I had no idea what to do. And he at least was able to putter a few things together and help get the two stations back on the air. I was very grateful that he was there that night. He was always there in the right spot for us at the right time, whether it was here or professionally. It's just amazing. And yes, I miss him a lot too, even though I'm not in the industry anymore. I left a long time ago. But it was always great to see him at reunions and stuff. He managed to get the okay to do those fireworks shows for a few years out at Bar Beach, and thank goodness Bill would come out every year and help us hook the whole thing up. Otherwise, I don't know how the heck we would ever have been on the air. But again, those were a night I was asked to come down and help host it, and there was Bill to hook it up, and I knew when he nodded that everything was good, I knew we were going to be on the air and ready to go. So he was always there.
I think beyond the flags, we carry on Bill's legacy by talking about it in the room, and I don't know, we're a bunch of old alcoholics, I guess. That's a technical term. Thanks. The name stories up here, but yeah, Bill has become a part of all of us.
Yes,
That's his legacy.
it is. Sometimes I'll say something and I'll think back, okay, I know where I got that from. It's something I heard Bill say a lot, or, you are, I guess by the time you get to the point in life, we are your amalgamation of everybody you've met, and I always used to tell people who become new engineers who come to ABC, look at people, even the worst person here has got something that you can learn from. And we learned a lot from Bill. There was a lot of good parts, and he's made us all a better person because we knew him and because we lived with him.
Now, we know the family is pushed away from the table, and I don't think they're trying to get away from us. I think it's because of the son. I hope it's because of the son. But let's make it official, folks. Let's induct Bill Epperhart into the Hall of Fame. Here's the plaque, just like all the others. The WCWP Hall of Fame, Bill Epperhart, April of 2014. As I said at the beginning, I believe he was already in the Hall of Fame in my heart, but today's the day. Bill Epperhart. Dan should accept it on behalf of his dad. All right, let's call on Bill's son, Dan Epperhart, to come up and accept the flag. Very crowded on that platform. If you'd be so kind as to hold that, because I know some people want to take some pictures. Let's get Mr. We'll get Mr. Moser in here too. My father, Mr. Moser.
That's why they call you Mr. Moser.
Got enough?
I think so.
Dan, thank you so much for coming to the That'd be great. Should we hook this up so you don't have to hold it? That'd be great. All right, we'll leave the plaque right there and go to it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I didn't think this was going to be easy, but I didn't really expect it to be this hard. Thank you. Everyone, Dan, Frank, Bill, Moser, all your kind words, Jeff. I know my father would have been very appreciative to hear all these kind words, especially coming from such dear friends. And also congratulations to all the other inductees, Ted, Frank, and Rita. And thanks to Pete Bellotti for tracking me down and affording me the opportunity to be here today to speak on behalf of my father, Bill. I have a lot of vivid memories of this campus as a young boy. Saturday afternoons at the station with Dad, homecomings, late night pizza binges, but more importantly, being exposed to radio in a way that most young people are never afforded. I always remember being surrounded by kind, fun people, the kind of personalities that radio so often seems to attract. And at such a young age, the fun aspect was really what the WCWP experience meant for me. But now, decades later, I understand just what the WCWP family meant to my father. After his passing 14 years ago, I heard from former students, emails, told me how much they had learned from my father and what an impression that he had left upon them. And though I know he certainly enjoyed mentoring others, I know that he loved to learn every bit as much as he loved to teach. And I remember certain things he would always repeat throughout my youth. He always stressed the importance that you never stop learning, and how much he enjoyed being around people who really knew their stuff, for lack of a more expletive term, and also people who shared that passion for getting it right. And looking back, I believe that this is why the WCWP family was such a big part of his life, because he had the opportunity to both learn and teach simultaneously, all while surrounding himself with dear friends and students who shared these same passions that he did. And if he were here today, I know that he would be very humbled by this recognition from his peers. And as his son, I'm certainly proud of him today and always, and moved by this honor. But I believe that he would have been even more appreciative simply of the opportunity to have worked alongside so many great people and you would have been thankful just to have been a part of the WCWP family during what was such a formative time in its history. Thank you.
Great. Clearly heartfelt. Thank you, Dan. And again, on behalf of all of us, here's the official plaque for your dad, the induction of your dad into the WCWP Hall of Fame.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Well, now there are an even dozen members of the WCWP Hall of Fame, 4 in each of the last 3 years. According to my math, that's 12. And
Post-math, right?
Post-math, yes. And we hope that this continues for years to come. I think it's a wonderful thing. The station has a great legacy, and I think Dan was right, that after about 50 years, it was time to start to recognize those individuals. The station, well known in the industry, the people have become well known in the industry, and it was time to make them well known within the station. And you know what I find? I've been around the station now the last number of months, a bit more than over the last several years, and I find that the students are very receptive to have people come back and say something to them. I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. I left the industry in the early 80s, and so I can't, as Frank can, or as Bill can, I cannot talk to them and say what it is today that you could do, because what I did back in the 80s doesn't exist anymore. But they do want to talk to us. They are happy to talk to us. I find it interesting, when we were students, there was nobody 60 years old running around the station, because the station wasn't that old. I mean, the station is 53 now. We were there I was there in the early and mid 70s, so the station was about 10 years old. So there were no 60-year-old people running around the station talking about the old days. So I find it interesting that the students are actually willing to listen, but it is nice. I think it's nice. I think it holds great promise for the future that they're interested in such. So do you guys have anything to add to that?
Jeff, we've been up here yammering for the last 2 hours.
Right.
If there's anybody from the audience who wants to come up and tell that story, come on up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Come on, Michael, you got a good story.
You got a story?
Once you can tell in mixed company, Mike.
Yeah, come on up.
Stay there, Phil. That's all right.
All right. Here comes Michael
All right,
first.
Michael, go up, and we'll let Phil sit, because he can get up these days. All right, this is Phil Leibowitz, folks.
Hi, everybody. Just the story I want to reiterate was something related to what Frank said, and it's a memory of Bill, because Bill was a wonderful, wonderful person and a mentee for me, and I should say mentor for me. But I remember with that console that he built in our studios. It was the day, I think Mike was there, myself and Moser was there too. We were going to do a photo shoot for Stanton Cartridges, which was a promotional thing for them, and one of the highlights of the shoot was supposed to be Bill's brand new studio. And we talk about things and legacies that live on. Well, Joel Feltman has the nickname of Fudgy, and it's because of that day that Bill Epperhart branded him Fudgy, because he thought the Formica was dirty, and he went and put Ajax all over the whole console and got it into the Lycon switches that Bill had so proudly installed. So he had to replace the stitches. But Fudgy's legacy is due to what Bill Epperhart branded him that day when he screwed up all the switches on the console. And unfortunately, I was not in touch with a lot of people when Bill passed, and I was very saddened to hear it. But he's somebody I'll always remember.
I'll use this. Hello, everyone. I'd just like to say that certainly every story that I've heard here today, it's all true. There's not an ounce of BS in anything that we heard here.
Mike Phillips.
Hi, all. Driving home from ABC at midnight, Bomb the Dog sounds, Bill coming to the radio station, all the Teddy David stories. I guess one thing we didn't mention that I guess, what is he, the Eddie Haskell of radio, as I recall?
Yeah, that's good.
The Eddie Haskell of radio.
He and Bill kind of shared that, though. It depends on which
I don't
day
know.
it was.
Depends who's telling the story. But there's no question that every word was said up here with love. I can verify that. WCWP has given us all certainly a family feeling, and all the people inducted today. I mean, I knew 3 of them. Again, my thanks goes out to all of them, and yes, every word was true. You can hang your hat on every single word.
Thanks, Mike.
You know, Dan was talking about before that I have been able to get some of the WCWP folks back up at WABC, and I think we've had 4 or 5 go through, and I understand that. One snuck in. He does sometimes. Well, we'll leave it there.
Neil, you got anything to say?
The thing that still exists, which I think is great, is that Bill was able to do that back in our day because he knew who the people were that deserved the break. When somebody came to him and said, "Who do you got that's good?" Bill knew who to do it. And that's exactly what I said to Dan. I said, "Who do you know? Who do you got there that's good?" And they still exist here. And that's, you know what? A legacy, this is fantastic, but that's a better legacy. The fact that the station that gave us what it gave us 40 years ago is still doing the same thing for students today. And I think that's a wonderful legacy for all of us that have been there. And to know that that's still going on is great.
Yeah, Bill Moser was just prompting me. I had said something on the way in here today, and I met Dan for the first time in 15 years or more. And I was saying to Dan on the way in that I was kind of the next wave after Bruce and Jeff, et cetera, and got to take advantage of all they had done, but especially Bill Epperhart. I got to learn on the board that he built, and that's how I learned how to do radio. These guys showed me, but it was his equipment that worked so well, and I remember going up to WABC to see Bill Moser do a shift and seeing what the equipment looked like, and it didn't look quite as good as what we had at WCWP. So, thanks to Bill Epperhart for creating that for us. He was, in some ways, intimidating to guys like me. And I remember the other part of the story is not long after I started doing this, I was way in the back listening to an air check, and he walked in. And so my heart dropped, and he said, "No, let me hear it." And there was one segue that he heard, and he said, "That was pretty good." Then he kind of walked out. I've never forgotten that. It was a big moment. So exactly. Thanks.
That's Neil Marks, folks.
Jeff?
I can say, one thing about Bill Epperhart. Bill used to tell me that he used to say, "You were on the board yesterday afternoon, weren't you?" And yeah, he said, "I can tell. I can always tell when you're on the board." And he taught me, and I was always high praise. I got a big kick out of that when he would tell us things like that. It was great stuff. And I want to walk over here and talk to my friend and cohort, Bruce Leonard, who said he had a couple of notes to say. We're from the same era.
Thank you, sir.
Not era.
Oh, well, that too. I was lucky enough to work with both Bills and Frank. Congratulations to everyone. Rita, I missed, but I listened to her forever. No one's told a Frank D'Elia story.
Uh-oh.
And that's a problem. That's an error, as you said. Must have been 1971. I guess you were graduating at the time.
Okay.
I was doing news for you as the news director, and you decided one day, I don't know why, that you just didn't want to be news director anymore. I was there preparing for some kind of a newscast, and you said, "Okay, you got this, you ripped the copy, you know how to do this thing or whatever." I said, "Yeah." I said, "You want to be news director?" I said, "Here." I didn't have a chance to answer you. I was news director, Frank was gone. I learned more from you about setting up news and thinking about things before I learned it, before I did it. Then there's Bill, who taught me how to edit. Jeez, That was crazy. You, Moser, Epperhart used to go to lunch constantly. I'm in the studio with an editing block working on an Olivia Newton-John song that Bill had me chopping up, and it was perfect. I nailed it. I know I did. Can I go to lunch with you guys? Bill walks in. Nope, fix that. And you're walking out. I turn around and I see Frank laughing his ass off. As they're walking away, you know. One more quickly, and then you have to tell the story about Gannon College and Bill Epperhart. Okay.
Good one.
It's my lovely wife, Tamara. I'm blessed for her to be here, but I was married before. I was working for Howard Stern, WNBC Radio, engineering, going through a divorce that Howard just barely mentioned on the air. Phone rings in the studio. Howard used to take phone calls all the time. Guy calls up, this is Mrs. Leonard's attorney. And starts to say stuff and had facts about things that nobody could know. It was Ted. He put me through hell for about 10 minutes. I had no idea until afterwards he called me and told me who it was. I thought I was going to die. So you're talking about a guy who can pull a practical joke. I had no idea. Can't recognize the voice. It was just amazing. Anyway, back to you. Thanks. Congratulations again to everyone.
Thank you for the reminder, Bruce. Bill Epperhart, this is great. In one spring, the Post basketball team made the national playoffs. You know, we're in the big night, Final Four, folks. Tonight's the night. But Post was never in the big time, you know, field of 64, but they were in Division II. So this particular year, they were in the playoffs out in Pennsylvania, out in Erie, Pennsylvania. And Bruce and I drive all the way out to Erie, Pennsylvania. And all of this is on short notice. And I asked Bill if he could run the studio for the games. And he thought about it. He didn't really want to do it. And he says to me, all right, tell you what, we're going to do it, but I'll only do it if we do, this is going to be the tightest, best, this is going to be the best produced thing. It's going to top anything we ever did. Okay, we're in. So we came up with new jingles, came up with everything. So we get out there, and he says, and I want you guys to do interviews, and you're going to feed this stuff back, and we're going to have cuts, and we're going to do all of this stuff. Well, the way road games were done back then in the 70s were literally over a telephone line, and we didn't have communication with the station except in between. When we were during a break, we could pick up a phone and say hello. Everything was done on stopwatches. And I became quite proficient at that, I must say, through the years. But on this particular night, we're going to these breaks, and Bill would tell us what time to come back from the break. And it wasn't come back in 30 seconds. It was come back at 29 1/4, or come back at 31 1/2. And I'd have to watch my watch, and I mean come back at that exact point. So one of the breaks, I pick up the phone, and he starts yelling at me, you came back at 31, and I told you 30 1/2. Do you think I'm doing this for my health? If you do this one more time, I'm shutting the transmitter and I'm going home. When I say 30 1/2 or 29, you come back and okay. All right, so now it comes time to go to the next break. And as I cue for the break, I go to start my stopwatch, and the watch fell out of my hand and went to the floor. And when I picked it up, I realized it had not started. So I start yelling into the phone that I don't have the time. Now, there was a way, Frank, you spent enough years in the studio, you could catch us up. You can give us a mark. You could say like 15 mark or 20 mark, and we could pick it up from there, and we could pull it off.
Sure.
It was an indoor place. It was so noisy, you couldn't hear. Bruce is nodding. He agreed. It was a packed little gym there, and standing room only, and they couldn't hear us back at the station. I'm pleading that I don't have the time. I don't know what time it is, and I'm not getting a response. In my head, it seems like it's about time to come back, and I'm pretty nervous about because I got lectured on the last break. All right, and I start to talk again. You know, welcome back, And we move on with the game. And all along, I'm thinking the next time I go to a break, oh man, I'm in a lot of trouble. Finally, there's a timeout. I go to the break. I say, you're listening to Post Pioneer Basketball. And on the other end of the phone is Bill. And I'm like this, okay, I'm going to get it. And he goes, that's what I'm talking about. You came back right on the dot. Now keep it up. Do that every time, we'll be fine.
Who says there's no radio gods?
That's right. So lucked out on that one.
You know, Bruce's story about how I made him the news director, didn't I do something like that to you, too?
Yes, you did. And it had to do with sports. I said I was a sports nut, and Frank had me doing news at the station. And I got elevated to doing news during the football games, which was a big assignment because you did pregame, halftime, and post-game news. So it was a lot of news and sports scores and all this stuff. And one day, all of a sudden, after the pregame news, Frank goes like this to me in the little news booth we had like this. And I'm thinking, I thought it went pretty well. I don't know why, nothing's ever perfect, but I thought it was okay. What does that mean? So I get in there and he says, you better pay very close attention to everything I do today because I won't be here on Saturdays anymore beginning next week. You're in charge. You're now in charge of the football broadcast. Really? I must have been WHN. I guess that's probably
was going to
about
work
when.
there,
yeah, so you're going to be working weekends. And that's what I mean. Just threw you in the deep end of the pool and you better figure it out. Because the next Saturday came and we got the game on the air and took it from there and the rest is history. But yes, that's.
It's just like when you learn to ride a bicycle.
We were being taught, and then you'd say, okay, you're ready.
Sometimes you just gotta look around. There's nobody holding up the bike. You're on your own.
That's right. That's exactly right.
There's another part of Bill's family over here to my left. Roberta, you want to come up and say something about Bill? Huh?
Oh, I'd come down to you.
Come on up. Okay.
Hi, I'm Roberta Epperhart, and I was married to Bill's brother, Mike Epperhart. The first time I met Bill Epperhart, I was 16 years old, and he was just a few years older.
All right.
And in the conversation, the first time I met him, I looked at my current boyfriend, Mike, Bill's brother, and I said, I have to go home and watch Dark Shadows. Big Dark Shadows fan. Well, Bill apparently was filming Dark Shadows. He said, well, I'm the cameraman for Dark Shadows. You are not. I'm 16 saying, no way are you the cameraman for Dark Shadows. He said, watch it tomorrow. The arm on the couch is going to be missing. I said, come on. Sure enough, the next day, run home for 4 o'clock, turn on Dark Shadows. They have a scene on the couch. Barnabas goes to lean, and the arm of the couch is missing. That's the way I knew Bill was really in television. But I have great memories. Loved Bill to death. He was a wonderful, wonderful brother-in-law. And now I'm blessed with a wonderful nephew and his wife is here, Leslie, and they have the most adorable twins, one of which in particular looks exactly like Bill. But great memories. And I'm an alum of Post as well. And Bill Moser mentioned about the music family, the Epperharts being musical. And fortunately, my son inherited the music genes, and he did his internship here at the radio station. He's now in the orchestra of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, but he's been on tour for about 14 years now with different shows. He got the Epperhart music genes and the voice.
Another part of the Epperhart family is Pete Vogel. Pete, come on over and say a few words about Cuz.
Good to see you, Frank.
It's on.
I'm in Wabia. So Bill and I are about 10 years apart, and so Bill Moser and I actually gave his eulogy. And building on what Roberta said about Dark Shadows, right, is, I can't tell you, I mean, kids today, right? Kids today with cable systems with 500 channels and the internet, of course. But I can remember, probably the time that you and Bill first started there. And Bill wasn't your on-air guy, but occasionally he was. So to be like a 10 or 11-year-old kid and sit there and realize your cousin, who's Big Bill Edwards, what's the name that he used, coming through the speakers in the living room. And I'm sure that's an experience all of you who've been involved, whether you were in the front or in the back, was an enormous thrill for your families, to be able to have that kind of experience. But, when you talked about the remaking of the board, I know we talked about this years ago when we got together for the plaque, but yeah, my father was the guy who built the woodworking around the board. So Bill definitely got everybody involved. And the last thing I would say is just funny thinking about being in the wedding when Danny's parents got married. And a couple of years ago, maybe even more than a couple of years ago, I'm leafing through a drawer and I pull out the wedding pictures. And so thinking about that time, it's like it could have been the album cover for Hotel California or something. It was to look at those pictures of everybody. Roberta and I were in the wedding as well. The floppy hats, the ruffles, the whole bit.
Blue felt
was right.
No, they were velour. And except it was hot as hell, as I remember.
Right. So just as these stories do, it took me right back there. Thank you.
All right, Jay wants to say a few words here.
Old man. For anybody here who doesn't know who I am, I'm Jay Elsweig. I was here in 1962 to 64. 1961, WCWP got started. When I came in, I had heard that there was a radio station, but it was still, it was kind of nebulous at the time. I took a course in high school called Radio English, and at that time, we had to take short stories and adapt them into radio plays and do the sound effects, and we did. I'm really a different era than most of you, than all of you probably. In fact, I'm going to be 70 next year. I stayed away from CW Post for about 48 years or 49 years. I'm back here at WCWP as an alumnus, and I'd like to let you know what it was like before the FM station. We had a little studio about as large as this table behind what was known as the Language Lab. The Language Lab was a place where people who took language courses could tape themselves and listen back the foreign languages that they were studying. And the station had one announce booth and one engineering booth. And we didn't engineer for ourselves all the time. There was always an engineer and an announcer, and sometimes we switched places. But back then, most of the founders of the station were people like Henry Niemark, who was inducted last year, 2 years ago. He was like the program director, basically. And there was a fellow named John March who had a program called Strictly Jazz. We did most of our own programming because I don't think we really knew where to start and where to finish. And John today, actually, I've been in contact with a lot of the original people from the station. Hank Niemark, you may remember from here, and he went into television production. He was a stage manager for most years. He won like 13 Emmys for his work. John March went into real estate down in South Carolina, but he still makes his own commercials. And he does voiceover work mostly for business. There was a young man named Brant Vulcan. He was totally blind from birth. And Brant, unfortunately, is not with us today. He had one of the most mellifluous voices I have ever heard in my life, and he knew every single opera ever written. And he had a program called Opera Highlights. He could give you a total synopsis, and you could follow along with him on the back of the album covers, because that's what they used to do. And he would talk about the operas. He would tell you what to listen for, what it meant, who was in it. I mean, the guy was encyclopedic. And unfortunately, he passed away about 2.5 years ago, and he had gone on. He was a professor of history eventually. He had a PhD from NYU and from City College. He had a number of degrees. And he started his opera stuff and his history stuff here at Post. We had two other illustrious people that I can recall, actually 4, including myself. There was Dick Heatherton, who most of you probably have heard with his rock and roll on WNEW, and there was Don Herlihy, whose father was Ed Herlihy. And these two fellas also had fabulous voices, and they had vast knowledge of what their programs were about, and it was mostly music. And I come to myself, and a fellow named Joe Monaster, who today is an optician over in Glen Cove, and we had a folk music program together. We had something called the Original Hootenanny, because on television at that time, this was the early 60s, folk music was very big, you know, Kingston Trio and, you know, and the Weavers were considered oldies at that time. Joe and I got together. We used to sing in a group together, and I had been in a number of groups, and I had a little bit of a recording career that lasted 1 year. And Joe and I would come into the studio. We had our guitars. We would sing stuff from Josh White Jr. and Pete Seeger and so on. And sometimes we would do the news. Now, where did we get the news? We didn't have an AP line. We didn't have UPI. We had nothing except the New York Times. And the first page of the second section of the New York Times had something known as the index. The index was a list of the chief stories and a little tiny synopsis about them. So that was our newscast. Our weather forecast was look out the window, hold your finger up, see which way the wind is blowing. What kind of weather is it? Well, I can only promise you one thing, it's going to be dark tonight. And we had some mishaps at the station, too. We all had our third-class license, by the way, which was Harry Lowenthal, by the way. He was our chief engineer. He got these licenses for us to operate the transmitter. You couldn't touch the transmitter unless you had a license. Yes. Okay, I know, time.
We got to give up the room till us at an event tonight.
Okay, well. Okay, well, anyway, I'm very, very proud to be back. I'm very happy to be back. I retired 9 years ago, and I said, if I don't have fun in my retirement, I'm going back to work. And I've been having fun. It's been a fabulous experience coming back again. And as I say, I didn't know any of you, but now you know me.
Final few words, Bill Moser.
Way back in the day when I was young and handsome and skinny, I had a roommate by the name of Laurie Seraphin. We lived together for a couple of years. I'm in touch with her through Facebook, and Facebook is an amazing way of reconnecting with old relationships. Laurie reported on her Facebook group that she was face-to-face with a gun. And the most we can gather from what she's reported that it sounded as though she might have been held up or mugged. She is recovering, I guess, from the incident and hasn't really offered any great detail, although a large number of people that are friends with her are asking what happened. But it was a little shocking. But she claims that she was lucky to be alive following this incident. So I just thought I'd pass it along.
All right, that's gonna do it, folks. Thank you very much for coming out, and to our 4 inductees, to the Epperhart family for representing Bill, and for Frank, and congratulations on being grandpa. Thank you. And for Ted, and for Rita, and thanks again for being here. That's it for today's edition of WCWP Hall of Fame.
Everybody's welcome to go back to the station and hang out, but I think we should take some pictures.
Great.
Anyway, one night, he was working overnight. I was relieving him early. This startled look. How long has that been going on? Started listening about 45 minutes ago.
Used to, when I first went to ABC, used to wine carts.
We still have a cart machine.
Wow.
We do. We do. Oh, that's nice.
It's going in the museum.
And then they sent it home with Bill Moser.
They're going to put it in the museum next to us next.
Do you know Zach Parker?
Yes. Zach Parker.
Zach, pleasure to meet you, Zach.
Zach is one of our tech guys. He's great on the board. He's great.
Music with Jeff Kroll.
Yeah, well, it's good then.
You're listening to The Rock Show with Jeff Kroll on WCWP.
I remember doing anything, hour after hour of classic Mahler.
Oh my goodness, Bruce was hysterical.
Come to me also.
And that was
they
what
had
I just remember my father after, many hours trying to find ways
Oh,
to
wow.
entertain me with, after it was like the playground aspect was done, and I learned a little, like, climb on things and be a maniac, pulling tapes off the wall, put them in, and play. I made a few little mixes on the cassette deck in the back, I remember. 80s, and it was 80s heavy metal, my introduction to Megadeth and Metallica. That's what the kids were listening to in college in 85. So I was.
I almost told the story.
That was Frank who dropped me into the job. Said, next week, pal, it's yours. That's it. I'm not going to be here anymore.
Remember the famous Warren story?
Flat screens everywhere. That's how they get stuck. You can't have that.
The big TV.
Right, with golf on in the other room.
You were doing something else.
Is playing on radio.
Thursday night.
And I got yelled at for climbing that tower.
Did
you go up on that?
I get up. I was nimble. I guess I got up, maybe not high, maybe to the first, crossbar, and a guy in a pickup truck, pulled over, yelled, and gave me a good yelling. I was all upset. He said, "Dad, some guy yelled at me from climbing the tower." That's like, screw him. Go have fun. Don't go too high. Don't go too high up. I said, all right.
TV audio is traditional.
I said, "Dad, can I have another $1? Get another chip witch down in the cafeteria. Chip witches, pizzas, anything."
Get on the French ticket over the tower. Every time it's Fox, they still pull that story.
Don't you remember in the old studio, something that, like the one next door?
I have them doing field trips. You give them a flash recorder, go out and do something, bring it back, edit it, make a story out of it, put some music.
Make sure the lights are on
So
in the
they're
tower.
just-
We put a little label, lights, right? They flip the switch and they say, "I ain't on now."
So this is 81 or 82.
Before the
Friday night, you tell them, when you can't see the tower lights, somebody has to climb up and make sure they're there.
I heard about
You get
that. I heard about
Wait till
that.
it was so foggy that you couldn't see the top. Somebody's got to verify they're on. Go ahead, it's your turn.